Hey there. So, in regards to the discussion questions we're answering, I'm going to start with environmental justice. So, what is environmental justice? Basically, I've boiled it down to confronting systemic injustices that affect human health and ecological well-being. Um, an injustice being an unequal distribution of risk by an institution such as a government or corporation. So the kind of like earlier ideas of environmental justice being sort of like early 70s, 80s kind of citizens looking to not have toxic chemicals on their land, right? And those kinds of injustices were corrected by early 70s um, policies that weren't necessarily equally distributed or enforced. And that's where you kind of get into the Warren County case and the PCB dumping. Fast forwarding to sort of like Summit 1 in 1991, that kind of definition of environmental justice is a bit more holistic, incorporating like ecological health, human safety in the workplace, human safety elsewhere, extraction, waste consumption, and sort of a holistic idea of Mother Earth, kind of going back to that idea of like Leopold and like thinking like a mountain, right? But now I really like Bulliard's framework for EJ, for environmental justice. It seems to really successfully incorporate a number of environmental justice principles. So I'm just gonna like list them out, even though we've read them. Right to protection from degradation, prevention as a public health model, precautionary principle, shifting the burden of proof, and redressing disproportionate impact through targeted actions. And I mean, my personal favorite kind of those is the use of the precautionary principle. It seems to have worked pretty well abroad, especially in places like the UK, where precautionary principle kind of like really helped in terms of like coal miners' diseases. Yeah, so that's kind of like what environmental justice is. It's the idea of looking at looking at environmental issues from a lens that incorporates other injustices perpetrated by governments or corporations, things that unequally affect different racial groups, ethnicities, colonized peoples, different socioeconomic groups. So that kind of like goes into the second question about intersections of race, socioeconomics, and history with environmental justice. Um, in terms of race, there's the idea of race playing into environmental justice concerns because of environmental racism, and how the distribution of risks has kind of followed the dominant power arrangement in society. This is like really evident in the United States, where because of the lack of representation of like African Americans in government, so in things like zoning councils, or even just like the legislature, like the national legislature, their voice, people's voices haven't been heard when making decisions about where industrial sites are going to be placed and that kind of thing. So that's kind of like one way that race intersects with environmental justice. Socioeconomics is kind of similar in that people who are poor or are working in sort of like low wage jobs tend not to have very good representation. And that affects their health at their job sites. It affects their health in their homes, and they tend to not be as well protected by poor people. Tend to not be as well protected by the legislation that has been passed already. And then history, I find is like a really interesting part of sort of the environmental justice conversation. I think it's interesting how sort of the win of capitalism over communism in the 20th century has played into our views of economic growth that like Speth talks about, as well as how colonization and military power has kind of played into environmental justice in the Caribbean. How we got here and who won different battles um, throughout history has really affected who bears the brunt of environmental injustices. So, for example, historically, um, dominant white Western powers have been able to conquer different lands. In case of the Bulliard reading in the Caribbean and on Vieques Island and Puerto Rico, the idea of military might basically being used to intimidate and also destroy on an island is like that didn't get there overnight. That had an entire historical backdrop of taking advantage of people beforehand and then not looking back at that history when trying to make reparations for it and trying to change the story. So the same thing goes with not the same thing necessarily, but something similar goes with capitalism, wherein because of sort of the success of capitalist markets in the 20th century, you see kind of this obsession with growth and consumerism as sort of like the end all be all in terms of how the economy is supposed to work, and the idea that because communist countries kind of like failed during the 20th century, that is not a way to go. However, the sort of business as usual capitalism is overly extractive and affects those who don't interact with the market disproportionately. As seen in the Story of Stuff video that we watched, those that are experiencing the woes of extraction are typically not those who are enjoying the benefits of the market, and those that are sort of not included in the market due to their socioeconomic standing are kind of seen as lesser. So that's that for those intersections. And then going on to the final sort of maybe hopeful question of what is a more positive direction regarding environmental justice concerns. I think that the dematerialization of economies is something that's very promising. Looking at kind of like what Beth's talking about, I learned last year in my business and sustainability class. I think that one of the best ways to sort of operate business as usual while also protecting the environment and individuals is capitalizing and monetizing on people's worries about the environment and about injustices and curing them through going back and having corporations go back and take a critical look at what they're doing in terms of the environment. Kind of thinking about what policy changes can be made. That's the typical thinking in terms of solutions for environmental injustices, and I think with strong enough support and evidence, perhaps that it could be a real solution, and like the idea of kind of mending those cracks and those holes that sort of environmental injustices fall through in terms of the current bureaucratic system of the U.S. government. There's really nowhere for those injustices to be cured. The EPA wasn't built, like Bulliard mentions in Chapter 1, to handle environmental injustices, and neither was really any other part of the United States bureaucracy. And I think that with the sort of support and empathy of more people, perhaps pushing for a more inclusive protection of the law for people who are experiencing environmental injustices and the admitting of the problem could do well.